iPhone 17 Pro Max or Google Pixel 10 Pro XL? Which one has the better camera? Well, last week I was in Hawaii, where I took hundreds of photos to fully push both phones' cameras. So here's how they both compare when it comes to the main module, the telephoto ultra-wide front, and also portrait mode, as well as some very special camera modes. But first, I want to start off with a telephoto, which is the iPhone's main camera hardware change this year. And here, both phones have a 48 megapixel sensor with the exact same aperture and sensor size too. However, the Pixel has a 5x lens compared to the iPhone's 4x lens. So at a 4x magnification, if we take a look at the flower in the center, we can see that the iPhone is a bit sharper, while also handling the exposure much better. The iPhone seems to push for a more HDR look, so the shadows are being pushed more than the Pixels. We can see this as the greens of the leaves are less punchy on the iPhone, and the shadowy areas have more detail. Neither photos are bad, just processed differently, and although we do have more detail on the iPhone, I personally do prefer the look of the Pixel. But which processing do you guys prefer? Let me know down below. Moving on to 5x, at first glance, they both seem more similar here. The Pixel, however, has a slightly brighter image. If we really pixel peep, we can see that the Pixel has a bit too much processing going on for my liking. Now, the pink flowers are more defined on the iPhone, while the detail on the Pixel seems to be getting smudged by its processing, especially if we look at the ridges here. At 10x, I'll be honest, no image is great here. The pink flowers in the center, where we are hoping to see the most detail, have just turned to mush on both. If I had to pick one though, I would probably pick the iPhone. Its processing is less aggressive, so if we look at the leaves, they're more natural, slightly more detailed, and just easier on the eyes. At 40x, we can actually see a clear difference. The detail on the Pixel is unmatched, and you can even make out individual bits of the plant, although it is far too saturated. The iPhone sadly is just an unusable image in all aspects. It's worth mentioning though that this is mostly thanks to the Pixel's ProRes zoom feature that's on by default. So what we're seeing here is an AI enhanced image. Here's it without ProRes if you're curious. Moving on to 100x zoom, which is what the Pixel can do while the iPhone is maxed out at 40, thanks to ProRes zoom, the Pixel is just a world apart. That being said though, the water does look quite unnatural, but the text and the railing is really impressive. However, if we remove ProRes, the Pixel becomes blurry, although you can still make out the object. The iPhone, however, is again overly sharpened, although you can still make out all the parts. Moving on to some video, this is at 20x zoom, and the iPhone here is the winner for me. Aside from just rock steady stabilization, there's clearly more detail, especially if we take a look at that box on the back of the boat. The Pixel has sadly turned it to mostly mush. This seems to be a common theme with the Pixel, I think. Its processing seems to murder detail when we're pushing the limits of its zoom range. And of course, there's no ProRes zoom in video, so we're not seeing any of these enhancements here. Onto some night stuff. In this 5x example, the clear winner is the iPhone in terms of the detail. If we take a look at the rocks, the surface has actual texture, unlike the heavy noise reduced Pixel. One more thing I want to point out is again the processing on the Pixel. If we pixel peep all the way back, we can see how well defined that small plant is here on the iPhone, whereas on the Pixel, its processing has almost destroyed it. Although the iPhone has handled most of the situation better, I will say that I'm not a huge fan of the overly strong highlight on the pillar, which does distract from the image. At 20x night, this is a bit of a tricky one, because the Pixel does have more detail, but it's overly processed detail. The iPhone is much softer, but more accurate. Like, if we take a look at the walls, we can see the straight edges breaking on the Pixel. So I'm leaning more towards the iPhone here, which from an aesthetics perspective, it's just way more natural. At 10x night video, it's pretty much the same story as the 20x day video. The iPhone is miles better at handling detail. The Pixel just loses itself in the processing, which turns into a mess. Not that either are particularly great here, but the iPhone does pull ahead. So overall, the winner for the best telephoto is the iPhone 17 Pro Max. And that's thanks to its better zoom night performance, better zoom video performance, and also a zoom that's more natural in most cases. Plus, it also handles detail more pleasingly at the longer end of the zoom range. Now, I do have to give credit to the Pixel 10 Pro XL because it's got a very impressive zoom range at 40x and onwards. It's just that all of that detail is not real detail, it's just generated. I would love to hear what you guys think about this. Moving on to the front camera now, this is the iPhone's second big camera upgrade of the year, and that's a brand new 18 megapixel 1x1 sensor with this really cool ability to take both portrait and landscape shots even when you hold your phone in portrait orientation. The front camera on the Pixel is a much larger 42 megapixel sensor, so let's see how they each stack up against each other. In daytime, we can clearly see the Pixel being noticeably sharper than the iPhone, obviously due to its higher megapixel count. If we take both images at face value, no pun intended, I do prefer the Pixel. It's brighter and pops more. It's just a more pleasing selfie, so I'm gonna give this one to the Pixel. I'm also surprised to see that they are both equally as wide here. In fact, I think the Pixel is a tiny bit wider, which is really interesting considering that we don't have that squared off sensor on the Pixel. However, one thing that I do want to point out is the quality of the detail. If I were to crop this image closer to my face, I would choose the iPhone. It's much less processed, my skin, my hair, my glasses, they're all smoother. Also, I'm not covered in artifacts or noise, and yeah, the image just looks higher quality. Just something to consider if you like to crop. Okay, so this is a front-facing video test between the iPhone 17 Pro Max and the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL. First of all, let me know which one looks better. Take a look at the shadows, the highlights. Let me know which one has more detail. Also, let me know which one sounds better. This is the sound coming out of the iPhone 17 Pro Max, and now this is the sound coming out of the Pixel 10 Pro XL. So I do prefer the iPhone here. It's able to keep my face bright whilst also keeping the sky nicely exposed. The Pixel has indeed managed to keep the sky nicely exposed as well. However, my face is suffering slightly under my hat, where it's much darker. When it comes to stabilization, they both appear to be mostly the same. And as for the mics, let me know which one do you guys think sounds better. At night, the iPhone's front camera handles the situation much better. The detail in my shirt has been kept, as well as the individual hairs on my face. So overall, the award for the best front camera goes to the iPhone 17 Pro Max. Although the Pixel does have the higher megapixel count, it suffers at night, and also again with its processing, especially if you want to crop into that fine detail. However, it is my choice for group photos, as the Pixel is actually a tiny bit wider than the iPhone 17 Pro Max. Which brings me to the main camera, and here the iPhone comes with an f1.78 aperture and with a 48 megapixel sensor, whereas the Pixel comes with an f1.68 aperture and a 50 megapixel sensor. Also, the iPhone sensor is a tiny bit bigger, which combined with its lower resolution should make it perform better at night. But before that, let's start with daytime photos. And here, both phones are great. The exposure is really good, the detail, yeah, I'm really happy with either photo here. Moving on to a slightly more challenging daytime image where we have some strong backlight, the Pixel handles the exposure much nicer, having more detail in the shadowy areas of the branch here. I'm still not a fan of its overly processed look in terms of the sharpness, but I think it's a nicer image. In this next example, we can see the iPhone once again pushing for a more HDR look, as it's lifted those shadows. The Pixel has managed to keep more detail in the image, especially if we look at the rocks at the back. Those 2 extra megapixels are coming through, despite the Pixel giving you a 12 megapixel image by default as a result, as opposed to the iPhone's 24 megapixel image. But overall though, I do prefer the iPhone here just because of its brightness. If we move into a lower light scene, such as indoors, the iPhone at first glance has a much more pleasing shot, as the plants on the centerpiece are way more punchy. The Pixel, however, has handled the highlights better, especially if we take a look at a skylight. In the second example, the Pixel, if we're not pixel peeping, has a nicer photo. The statue pops so much more than on the iPhone. However, in terms of keeping that fine detail, the intricate brushstrokes on the chest have actually been lost to the Pixel's processing. At night, the Pixel handled this scene much more pleasingly than the iPhone. There are no distracting highlights on the back, the tree in the foreground pops more, and for once, its detail is great without being too processed. In this next image, both phones are very similar, although I do prefer the Pixel here. The tree on the right is much brighter, and it also helps lift the overall image a bit. The iPhone, I can't help but think overall, is just a bit dark. When it comes to the 2x zoom, which crops into the sensor, the Pixel here has handled the scene much better. The statue has more visible detail as due to stones beneath it. Again, it's a bit more processed, but I would say it's still nice. The iPhone is just way too dark. In the second example, we have the same story. The text on the Pixel is more readable, there's just more detail in the shadows, whereas the iPhone is once again a bit too much on the darker side. Moving on to some higher resolution photos now, taken at the native resolution of their sensors. In terms of detail, if we zoom into the leaves at the top here, the Pixel has much more detail than the iPhone. I think the Pixel as well has a much nicer exposure, whereas the iPhone has tried to push the shadows, causing the image to wash out slightly, whilst also pushing the highlights a bit too far. Just take a look at the punchiness of the leaves compared to the Pixel. Now, if we swap to a raw example now, where we have pushed the shadows all the way up and the highlights all the way down to see how much detail we're capturing, there's no competition here. The Pixel has managed to retain all the highlight detail here, whereas this information has been completely lost on the iPhone. Now, onto some 4K 60 videos now. At the start, both appear to be very similar. However, when looking off into the horizon, we can see that the iPhone is pushing those shadows more and showing more detail. The Pixel is a bit too contrasty for my liking. Same thing when looking towards the trees. The iPhone has handled the exposure much better. And moving on to 4K 60 night, neither phone has handled the situation particularly well, as most of the details are just lost into darkness. However, if we take a look at the umbrella and the building, the iPhone does have a slight edge when pushing those shadows to show detail. It also handled the exposure better if we take a look at near the lamp. The leaves of the bush also aren't lost to the strong highlight. So overall, the winner for the best main camera is the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL. I think the Pixel has performed better overall. It managed to handle most situations better, keeping the image punchy, whereas the iPhone has sadly darkened it too much. For video, however, the iPhone has been superior, but for photos, I'm going to give it to the Pixel. And that brings me to their ultra-wide modules, where they actually both have a 48 megapixel sensor, and they both have the exact same 1/2.55 inch sensor size. Like, the only difference is actually the aperture. The iPhone has an f/2.2 aperture as opposed to f/1.78 on the Pixel. So the Pixel should have a better low light performance. Starting off with some daytime samples first, for me the iPhone here is ever so slightly nicer. Now, both are great, but the image is a bit more punchy on the iPhone, with a tree in the middle just popping more. I do think the iPhone's processing is a lot stronger on the ultra-wide, as if we take a look at the grass at the bottom, it's so sharp that it's almost distracting. We're not having this issue on the Pixel at all. In this next example, both have handled the situation pretty well, as they're almost identical. The biggest difference is in the dynamic range. Take a look at how well the iPhone has handled the highlights in the sky. When it comes to indoors, the iPhone is once again slightly punchier. Not only is it brighter, but it is also handling the highlights better. Take a look at the details in the lights. The iPhone is slightly noisier, but again, you do have to zoom in quite a lot to see it. Moving on to RAW, pushing the highlights and shadows as far as they go, both seem very similar in terms of the detail recovered. When it comes to the detail captured, the iPhone is noticeably sharper and has more detail, like it looks higher res, especially if we take a look at the base of the tree here. At night, in this example, they both have not done well. The detail is lost on both. The Pixel, however, has managed to retain slightly more detail if we take a look at the tree trunk and the bush. The iPhone has just been lost in processing. Neither, however, has an image that I would want to use. In the second example, both phones have done much better. I do prefer the iPhone, however, just because of how it manages to keep the highlights in check, and also because of its aesthetic. I prefer its darker tone, whereas the Pixel is brighter in the shadows, however, the detail is just full of artifacts. As for ultra-wide macro, here, the iPhone is just straight up better. The focus fall-off isn't as distracting, and the center pops a bit more, and it's really sharp. The Pixel is darker, softer, and also has a bit too much processing going on. In this next photo, it's the same story. The iPhone is sharper, has more detail, and also pops more. When it comes to 4K 60 ultra-wide video, there's actually a big difference here. Just take a look at the fine details such as the grass. On the iPhone, we can make out the strands, whereas they're completely merging together on the Pixel. We can see this even more if we take a look at the leaves on this bush. The iPhone is much clearer and much more detailed. Moving on to night, neither phone is great here. The iPhone is much darker and covered in noise reduction, making everything look smudged. The Pixel, however, is more detailed, although it is covered in very strong noise. Now, the Pixel does have a feature called Video Boost, and if we enable it, we can see a pretty big difference. The footage is decently more detailed, and also most of the noise has now been removed. But overall, the winner for the best ultra-wide is the iPhone 17 Pro Max, which I think has the better all-around ultrawide. It's punchier, it handles macro better, and the video is unmatched. Now, yes, the Pixel does have video boost, which is great, but remember, you do actually have to wait hours for that to process. Now, if you're thinking of ordering a new iPhone 17, you'll also need an awesome wallpaper to go for it. And we offer the best wallpapers on the market through our app, Wallpapers. All of our designs are 1x1 8K made by our designers, so you can use them on any device. Some designs even take months to make. The first wallpaper of each pack is completely free, with over 200 free wallpapers to choose from, and we also offer no ads at all. So you can download Wallpapers for free today by using the links below. Now, we are done with the individual modules. However, there are some modes that are not specific to one module, one of which is portrait mode. Here, the Pixel uses its main module for portrait mode, punching into 2x, whereas the iPhone uses its dedicated telephoto module at 4x. And the iPhone does have a much nicer image. It's sharper and with a much superior background separation. The Pixel also appears to be suffering from its processing again if you take a look at my zip. The tracks have merged into one another. Moving on to portrait mode pad, this one is a lot closer. Neither are bad. I think the iPhone just edges slightly ahead here. Its background separation is more natural, and there's also extra detail on the facial fur, making it pop more. When it comes to portrait object, it's a similar story. The background separation is better on the iPhone. The Pixel has some weird artifacting on the flower's edges. Also, just the processing in general, the iPhone is more natural, whereas the Pixel has over-sharpened the flower. Onto portrait night, the Pixel has handled this better at first glance, being a more tolerable image. The iPhone is almost too dark, whilst also being much noisier. However, if we zoom in, it actually has handled the finer detail better. The straw on the roof has been processed a bit too much on the Pixel. When taking a portrait selfie, the background separation on the Pixel is quite unnatural. Just take a look at the tree. The iPhone has handled this really well, and it is a much more usable image, especially if we take a look at my hat. Just look at how processed this is on the Pixel. So overall, the award for the best portrait mode goes to the iPhone 17 Pro Max. Not only has the iPhone handled most situations better, especially when it comes to background separation, but not being able to use that 5x module on the Pixel, I don't know, this is just a huge loss. So Google, please fix this ASAP. Now, aside from portrait mode, there are some more special modes that each phone has. For example, the iPhone lets you record in ProRes with a much higher bitrate and also in log, something that the Pixel doesn't let you do. Now, here's that same graded ProRes footage. It's probably not going to be easy to tell on YouTube, but you can see that thanks to log, we've been able to retain more detail in the sky. And also thanks to the higher bitrate of ProRes, the fine detail on the rocks and the leaves in the back is also a lot more legible. Now, Google does offer that video boost feature, and the interesting thing here is that it actually allows you to record a higher quality file that's also in a log-like flat profile. So it will allow you to push the image a bit more and give you more creative freedom if you do download that file from the phone. Here's the video boosted footage and how it compares to the iPhone's graded ProRes. Now, the iPhone can also shoot in 4x3 open gate if you use an app like Final Cut Camera, and you've also got an SSD connected. This will give you more vertical space to work with, so you can shoot once and then reframe that for both vertical and landscape. The Pixel, on the other hand, has a really cool camera feature called Add Me that lets you take group photos even if there's only two of you, as it can overlay two images on top of each other. And the Pixel also has way more advanced image editing, where you can basically describe what you wanted to edit, and it will edit that image for you. This is super fun and also super useful if you're into editing your photos afterwards. The Pixel is also able to do 8K video, whereas the iPhone maxes out at 4K. However, this is only 8K 30. Now, do take a look at the clarity difference between the 4K and the 8K on the Pixel. It's worth noting that it does still have that processed look to it. However, you can also apply video boost to it in 8K, and you will also get that flat profile with a higher quality file too. Moving on to slow motion, we can see a dramatic difference here. The Pixel records in 120 FPS in 1080p, whereas the iPhone can do it in 4K. And the difference in clarity is just huge, especially if we look closer at the texture of the water and even a fountain in the background. Now, when it comes to cinematic video, even though the Pixel is 1080p compared to the iPhone's 4K, the Pixel is actually the one that looks sharper and more detailed. And funnily enough, it doesn't look overprocessed either. Now, in terms of the blur, The Pixel is handling this so much better. It looks so natural, whereas the iPhone looks very soft in places. It kind of makes you question if the lens is smudged or if this is really bad quality. Now, both can also do brilliant astrophotography. As you can see in this example that was taken on a tripod with a 30-second exposure on the iPhone and a 4-minute exposure on the Pixel. However, the iPhone actually handled this low light situation much better. If you take a look at a detail in the grass, it is pin sharp. The Pixel seems to have really struggled here. Also, in terms of the stars and the space, both have managed to capture a decent amount. However, the iPhone does have a slight edge. In the second example, which actually took handheld with a 10-second exposure, neither phone has done well here, but it does give us some good insights, such as that the iPhone is able to handle those strong highlights better, whilst also producing a brighter image overall.
Hey guys, and welcome to a demo of the dual capture. I'm in Hawaii now. It's the perfect place to shoot this. And as you can see both me and also what I'm seeing. The cool thing is that I can also use all the lenses, so 1x, 2x, that's 4x, and that's 8x now. That's pretty cool. It is 4K 30 only. I can move myself around, which is pretty cool. Although this is not really a new feature. Android has had this since, I believe, the S4. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool. And, you know, I'm not sure how often I'll use this, but we do have it. So let me know what you guys think.
So when it comes to specials, the award goes to the iPhone 17 Pro Max. And that's because we get a ton of extra video modes, such as ProRes, OpenGate, as well as much better slow motion. Plus, the astrophotography is superior too, and also much faster to take. However, the Pixel does have some way better editing features. So, having said all of this, which one should you go for if the camera is your #1 priority? Well, the main camera is superior on the Pixel. However, in every other scenario, the iPhone has proven to be superior, especially in terms of portrait mode and the special modes. However, at the end of the day, it always comes down to your preference. As we've seen throughout, the iPhone tends to be better for most video situations, whereas the Pixel is great for those first glance photos. But its processing does leave you a bit stuck if you're wanting to edit or crop into the fine detail. Also, if you're in those situations with some really strong highlights and you're not using RAW, then the iPhone does tend to handle them a bit better. But yeah, let me know, what do you guys think? And also, which camera comparison do you want to see next? I'm Daniel, this is ZONEofTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.